I always believed I had an excellent intuition about people. From a young age, I prided myself on reading others quickly, on knowing when someone was lying or when they were genuine. Perhaps that was my first great mistake with Edgar. I assumed I'd always sense if something was off, that the moment any lie hovered in the air, my instincts would sound the alarm. But love can be a formidable blinder, even for those who think themselves immune. I met Edgar at a local art exhibition, where his easy laugh and gentle manner made me feel at ease from the first hello. He approached me by a painting of swirling blues and greens, chatting breezily about how the colors reminded him of a sunset he'd once seen in Iceland. There was a certain quiet confidence in his voice, a warmth that immediately drew me closer. We were both in our late 20s, each immersed in a busy life. I worked as a freelance writer, and he managed a small construction company. That evening, we strolled through the gallery as though we'd known each other for years. By the time we parted ways, I had his number scrawled on the back of my ticket, a swirl of anticipation coursing through my veins. We began dating in that sweet, whimsical phase where everything feels like a dream. He'd leave flowers on my doorstep, send me good morning texts that always managed to make me smile, and cook me dinner at his cozy apartment where we'd talk late into the night about our hopes and fears. I remember being enthralled by the way he listened to me. His gaze firmly on my eyes, never drifting away, always asking questions that proved he truly cared about my answers. He was divorced, he said, and carried a bit of sadness over how his first marriage had fallen apart due to irreconcilable differences. But he assured me he'd learned from the pain, that he was ready for a new beginning. I believed him wholeheartedly. He never showed bitterness toward his ex-wife. On the contrary, he spoke kindly of her. I took this as a sign of maturity. Over the course of a year, we grew inseparable, moving from casual dating to something more serious. The day he proposed, in a quaint little bakery where we'd had our first brunch date, I said yes without a second thought. At the time, my parents were skeptical because he revealed so little about his past. My father asked pointed questions about Edgar's family, but Edgar would only say he was an only child whose parents passed away early. He had been largely on his own, relying on scholarships to get through college. My father felt uneasy, but I dismissed his concerns. Love fueled my certainty that Edgar was the one. We married in a small ceremony by the seashore, with only our closest friends and a few extended relatives to witness our vows. The wind tousled my hair, and the sea breeze carried laughter and champagne toasts into the golden afternoon light. It felt magical, as though every good thing in my life had converged in that one moment. For the first few years, our married life felt stable and content. We bought a modest house just outside the city, a place with a small garden where I planted lavender and rosemary. Edgar worked hard at his construction company, leaving early in the morning and returning at dusk. But he always found time for a quick kiss before heading off, and he made a point of calling during lunch breaks just to hear my voice. We talked about having children someday. I remember spending Sunday mornings lying in bed, imagining our future little boy or girl toddling around the yard while Edgar ran after them with a grin. Nothing seemed amiss. Nothing hinted at the storm that was brewing behind closed doors. Gradually, however, I noticed changes in Edgar's routine. He began coming home later than usual, muttering about extended projects or emergency job site complications. He often left on weekends, claiming he needed to meet clients who could only schedule meetings on Saturdays. Sometimes he said he'd be gone for just an hour but returned after 5, giving hurried apologies about how negotiations had unexpectedly dragged on. At first, I worried about his stress levels, picturing him juggling difficult contractors and demanding clients. But the more it happened, the more a faint thread of unease wound its way through me. He would forget small details he'd told me just a day before, or once, he inadvertently mentioned a man named Kevin, who was supposedly a big new client, and then later claimed that man's name was actually Kenneth. When I confronted him about the discrepancy, he brushed it off, saying he was tired and mixing up people. My intuition pricked me, but I dismissed it. I wanted to trust my husband. Another curious thing occurred around our 5th anniversary. Edgar seemed more guarded with his phone. Whereas he used to leave it lying around, sometimes even letting me use it to check emails, he started keeping it on him at all times, the screen facing down whenever he placed it on a table. He changed his lock code without telling me, explaining it was a new company policy to keep phone data secure. I tried not to read too much into it, though the flicker of suspicion continued to spread inside me like a slow ember. We still shared affection, occasional romantic dates, and laughter that felt real. Yet beneath the surface, something had shifted. Then, one night, a call came through on the landline. I answered, and a female voice I didn't recognize asked, "Is Edgar there?" She sounded surprised when I said I was his wife. The call ended quickly with a rushed apology and a click. I confronted Edgar about it, demanding to know who she was. He claimed it was a potential client's assistant, calling from a personal phone she rarely used, thus the confusion. It felt flimsy, but he seemed annoyed by my questioning, turning it around on me. "Don't you trust me? Don't you know how hard I work for us?" His anger stung, and I felt guilty for suspecting him. I apologized and resolved to quell my paranoia. Time passed, and Edgar's absences continued. He explained away everything with plausible reasons. Last-minute construction problems, supply chain delays, a co-worker's meltdown requiring Edgar's intervention. My suspicion ebbed and flowed, sometimes flaring hot, other times receding under the weight of his persuasiveness. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something was very wrong. Late one autumn evening, I found him in the study, rummaging through his desk drawer. When he saw me, he stiffened. I asked what he was looking for, and he claimed it was an old set of blueprints. But why search for blueprints in the dark without the lights on? Again, his excuse was that he didn't want to wake me. I forced a smile, but I slept fitfully that night, haunted by images of secrets swirling behind Edgar's eyes. Finally, a pivotal moment arrived. One Saturday, he told me he'd be gone for a few hours to meet a client. Instead of spending another weekend alone, I decided to surprise him. Maybe I'd bring him coffee, a small treat while he hammered out business details. He'd shared the address of the project site in passing, so I drove there, expecting to see a half-finished building. Instead, I found a row of suburban houses. Confused, I parked on the curb and double-checked the address on my phone. Then I noticed Edgar's car in a nearby driveway. My heart thudded dangerously as I approached the house. Through the large front window, I spotted Edgar inside with a woman. She was about my age, dark-haired, wearing casual clothes. They laughed about something, and the woman placed her hand on Edgar's arm in a way that spoke of familiarity. My blood ran cold. Before I could react, 2 young children bounded into the room, squealing, "Daddy's here, Daddy!" They leapt into Edgar's arms, and he caught them with practiced ease, smiling in a way I'd never seen him smile before. I stumbled back to my car, my mind a chaotic tempest. Daddy. The word echoed in my thoughts with crushing force. Edgar had children, a second life, right there in the suburbs. I drove home in a daze, nearly running a red light. By the time I parked in our garage, my shock had solidified into a trembling fury. All the excuses, the weekend absences, the late nights, suddenly it all made horrifying sense. My husband had another family, 2 children, a wife or partner by the looks of it. Everything I knew was a lie. I collapsed on the couch, shaking with sobs that turned into guttural wails, overwhelmed by betrayal. When my tears finally subsided, a cold resolve took their place. He had lied to me for years, stolen precious time, built an entire double existence. He thought I was oblivious, trusting, easy to fool. Well, I was done being clueless. I would find out everything, and then I would make him pay. In the days that followed, I sifted carefully through Edgar's belongings whenever he was out. I dug up receipts hidden in jacket pockets, old notes scribbled on business cards, suspicious appointments in his calendar. The more I discovered, the angrier I grew. There were mentions of birthdays I knew nothing about, references to a woman named Amber, presumably his other wife or partner, and even school events for the children. I found a small ring tucked away in a corner of his sock drawer, a ring engraved with initials that weren't mine. My hands shook as I held it. Every clue confirmed just how extensive his deceit had been. But rage alone wasn't enough. I needed a plan. Confronting him recklessly could jeopardize my chances of exacting real revenge. I wanted him to fall, to lose everything he cherished in both families, if that was what it took to show him the cost of betrayal. Perhaps that makes me sound cruel, but I'd been too gentle, too trusting. I was determined to expose him in a way that would leave him reeling. First, I considered quietly alerting Amber, letting her know Edgar was already married to me. But then I thought, if she's in the dark too, is she just another victim? Or was she a willing participant in his deception? I decided I needed direct evidence before reaching out to her. I had to be absolutely certain how much she knew. Over the next month, I tailed Edgar discreetly. I used my freelance flexibility to my advantage, following him when he left for work, snapping photos whenever he entered that suburban home. I documented everything: the kids embracing him, the casual kisses he shared with Amber, grocery store trips they made together, the stolen looks of a happy family. It made me sick to watch the man I once adored living such a perfect second life. Yet my determination crystallized with every snapshot. If he was going to break my world, I would smash his illusions just as thoroughly. Late at night, I combed through public records, searching for marriage certificates or property deeds. I found a deed to that suburban house, but it was in Amber's name only. No sign of Edgar. His official address was still the one he shared with me. As for marriage records, I discovered that he and Amber had married in a private ceremony in a neighboring county under her maiden name. My breath caught in my throat. He'd committed bigamy. The legal ramifications alone were staggering. I printed out all the relevant documents, feeling my pulse hammering with cold anger. Now I had undeniable proof. The question was how to use it to deliver the maximum blow. I considered going to the police immediately, lodging a formal complaint. But a friend who worked in law warned me that bigamy cases could be messy, with complicated outcomes. I wanted something more personal first. I wanted to watch him squirm, to see that smug confidence melt away. So I decided to wait, gather more leverage. I uncovered bank statements showing that he was funneling money into a separate account I'd never known about, likely to support that second household. All the while, he was diminishing our own finances, telling me we needed to be thrifty because his business had hit a rough patch. The audacity of his lies made my blood boil. Finally, the day arrived when I felt I had enough evidence to blow up both his families. And yes, I included my own marriage in the destruction, because let's be honest, there was no saving it. One morning, Edgar left early to accompany the kids on a school trip. I confirmed his location via the quiet vantage point I'd found near Amber's house. Then, with my collected documents in hand, I approached Amber's door. A part of me expected to see hatred in her eyes the moment she learned who I was, but it dawned on me that she might not believe me. Perhaps he'd told her I was a psycho ex, or that we were long divorced. Still, I was ready. Amber answered the door, looking puzzled at the sight of a stranger. I introduced myself calmly, explaining that I was Edgar's wife, his first and only legal wife. She frowned, claiming Edgar told her about his bitter ex who was obsessed with him. I let her talk until she ran out of breath. Then I handed her a stack of documents, including our official marriage certificate, photos of our wedding day, the property records. Her expression morphed from skepticism to horror. She began flipping through the evidence, her eyes wide. Tears welled up as she realized the man she loved was living a monstrous lie. She whispered that she had no idea that Edgar told her we'd ended things long ago. I believed her. She looked too shaken to be acting. At first, she sobbed uncontrollably, trembling in the doorway while I stood there, feeling a complicated mix of pity, validation, and raw fury. After a long pause, I gently asked if I could come in so we could talk. She led me to the living room where children's drawings cluttered the walls and an untouched breakfast sat on the table. It felt surreal being in the middle of a life that could have been mine. Amber struggled to regain composure, stammering questions. How long have you been married? Why would he do this? She was more frightened than angry, terrified of what this would mean for their kids. I understood. Her heartbreak mirrored mine. Despite my initial plan to tear everything apart, I momentarily felt a pang of empathy for her. But then I remembered what Edgar had done to me, how he'd stolen our marriage from under my nose. My resolve returned. I told Amber everything, how I discovered his second life, the photos I had, the records, the undeniable proof. She broke down again, but I pressed her. Did she have a marriage certificate with Edgar? She nodded miserably, fetching it from a drawer. There it was, with both their signatures and a date that overlapped our own marriage. Bigamy. A crime, a moral travesty, a living nightmare. Amber's anguish was painful to witness, and for a moment I questioned if my vengeance was aimed at the wrong target. But she had unwittingly become part of this web, and I needed her cooperation. I proposed a plan. We would confront him together. She hesitated, worried about her children. I told her I understood, but insisted that Edgar deserved to face the fallout of his lies. She silently agreed, though I could see the turmoil in her eyes. Our pact was sealed. We arranged everything meticulously. I set up a hidden camera in Amber's living room, ensuring we'd capture the confrontation from start to finish. Then we waited for Edgar's return from the school trip. I lingered in the shadows of the hallway while Amber paced anxiously. When he finally came home that afternoon, the kids ran to greet him. Amber hurried them into another room, telling them Mommy and Daddy needed to talk privately. Edgar looked confused, then froze when he saw me emerge. His face drained of color, and for a few seconds he seemed unable to speak. I have never seen such raw panic in another human being. It almost thrilled me. I let Amber speak first. She showed him the documents, tears in her eyes, accusing him of betraying their family. He stammered, tried to fabricate yet another story, but I stepped forward, brandishing photos of him leaving my house, notes he'd written me, official proof of our marriage. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He glanced around the room as if searching for an escape route. There was none. Amber demanded answers, her voice cracking with rage and heartbreak. He offered feeble excuses, saying he'd gotten in too deep, that he never meant to hurt anyone. But the lies had nowhere to hide now. Amber screamed at him, anguish pouring out in an unstoppable torrent. He begged for forgiveness from us both, tears beginning to run down his cheeks. It was nauseating to watch. In that moment, I realized how small he truly was, how pathetic. For years, he'd managed this double life, deluding himself that he could juggle 2 marriages without consequence. Now, under the harsh light of truth, he crumbled. Amber retreated to a corner, sobbing for her children's futures. I approached Edgar and told him I planned to press criminal charges for bigamy. His eyes widened in terror. He began to plead, saying we could fix this quietly, that he'd do anything to avoid a scandal. I let him squirm, then calmly said I'd let the authorities decide his fate. I left the hidden camera rolling the entire time. At one point, he tried to block my path, but Amber intervened, slapping him across the face. I walked out, my heart pounding with adrenaline, the sound of their heated argument echoing behind me. Driving home, I felt a dark satisfaction, yet a part of me trembled, unsure if I'd gone too far, but I quickly dismissed that doubt. The man deserved everything coming to him. That night, I slept better than I had in months, though I woke up multiple times reliving the confrontation. In the morning, I filed a formal complaint, providing all the evidence I'd gathered. My lawyer assured me that bigamy cases were rare but still taken seriously, especially with clear documentation. Edgar would be summoned. My mind raced with how the children would be affected, but I tried to push that concern away. This was about Edgar's betrayal, and if it uprooted both families, so be it. Word spread fast. Edgar showed up at our house later that week, pounding on the door, demanding I drop the charges. I refused to let him in. He cursed me through the locked door, calling me vindictive, screaming that I was destroying his life. I shouted back that he should have thought of that before lying to me for years. He eventually stormed off, leaving tire marks on the driveway. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Amber kicked him out, too. He was couch surfing at a friend's place, job precarious, finances in shambles. The news gave me a grim sense of triumph. He'd built an empire of deceit, and now every pillar was collapsing. In the weeks that followed, the legal gears turned. Edgar was charged, and though he made frantic attempts to defend himself, the evidence was overwhelming. His own lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal. Meanwhile, Amber filed for divorce, and I did the same, citing bigamy and irreconcilable differences. Our parallel lawsuits sent shockwaves through our social circles. People who once admired Edgar's work ethic now gossiped about his duplicity. His company's reputation suffered, and eventually, the board asked him to step down. He was left jobless, humiliated, and facing a criminal record. I should have felt vindicated, but the bitterness in my mouth tasted stronger than any satisfaction. I kept track of the fallout from a distance, hearing about Amber's struggles as she tried to hold things together for her kids. She eventually sold the suburban house, moving in with her sister to start fresh. Her children, confused and hurt, asked why their dad couldn't come home. She told me all this through a single phone call we shared, a raw conversation where she broke down, sobbing that she never wanted her kids to grow up without a father. I realized my revenge had indeed destroyed them too, even if I hadn't wanted the children to suffer. But how could I have avoided that? Edgar set these events in motion the moment he lied to both of us. As for me, the weeks became months. My own life felt hollow. I realized that a thirst for vengeance can consume you until you're left staring at the wreckage it created. There was no happiness in seeing Edgar's downfall, no real closure in watching him lose everything. Part of me even missed the illusion of the man I thought I'd married. Late at night, I'd wonder if there was a path we could have taken that might have ended less violently, with fewer casualties. But then I'd recall the sight of him hugging those other children, living a content life while I waited at home, and my anger flared again, reminding me that betrayal on that scale demands a reckoning. Eventually, Edgar's trial concluded with him pleading guilty to bigamy in exchange for a reduced sentence. He did some time in county jail, then emerged on probation. Legally, I was freed from the marriage, and the judge awarded me a significant portion of our shared assets. Amber's divorce left her with custody of the kids and minimal child support, given Edgar's precarious finances. He tried to find new work, but found few doors open to a man with a criminal record for bigamy. Rumors circulated that he was sleeping in cheap motels, barely scraping by. Sometimes I wondered if he'd call me in desperation, but he never did. We became strangers, bound only by the memory of a shattered life. Yet destruction, once unleashed, doesn't pick and choose. My own spirit felt battered. I wrestled with nightmares of the confrontation, the children's cries, the anguish on Amber's face. I lived alone in our house for a while, but it felt haunted. Every corner reminded me of what I'd lost, of what was never truly mine. I put it on the market and moved into a smaller apartment downtown, trying to carve out a new existence. My parents, who had once warned me about Edgar, tried to support me, but even they couldn't fully comprehend the depth of my turmoil. Friends tiptoed around me, unsure whether to congratulate me for exposing a con artist or offer condolences for my ruined marriage. Some mornings, I found myself crying unexpectedly, realizing I was mourning not just Edgar, but the future I'd envisioned. We'd talked about children, about traveling together, about growing old side by side. That entire dream had dissolved into ashes. And though I'd orchestrated his downfall, I recognized that in doing so, I'd also obliterated the illusions that once gave me hope. Vengeance might have felt necessary, but it came at a cost. I had to make peace with being the architect of that devastating reveal. Amber tried to stay in touch at first. She reached out, saying maybe we could lean on each other, two women scorned by the same man. But each conversation turned into a reminder of our shared pain, and eventually, we decided to stop contacting each other. The last thing we needed was a permanent bond rooted in betrayal. She wrote me a final letter, admitting that while she understood my actions, she wished I had found a way to handle it that spared her children the public spectacle. I wrote back with a terse apology, admitting my regret but standing by my decision. After that, silence. Time blurred. Seasons passed. I threw myself into work, taking more writing assignments than ever before. I traveled to conferences, pitched stories to magazines, buried my sadness in deadlines. Gradually, the raw edges of my heartbreak dulled, replaced by a lingering emptiness. The final piece of the legal process was settling the distribution of Edgar's assets. By then, he was nearly bankrupt, so I ended up with little more than a symbolic sum. Nonetheless, it gave me a sense of finality, a recognition that our marriage had concluded in a cold transaction. My father once told me that some truths, once uncovered, carry more pain than ignorance ever could. I came to understand that intimately. Knowing everything about Edgar's treachery validated my instincts, but also left me feeling disoriented, as if the ground beneath me could never be trusted again. Even as I tried to date new people, I found myself reflexively suspecting them, searching for hidden secrets, reading too much into every unexplained detail. I turned jaded, and it took a few more heartbreaks before I could start to open up again. My revenge had taught me that illusions can be a fragile comfort, but reality, no matter how brutal, can't remain concealed forever. Sometimes I'd see a photo online of Amber and her kids, courtesy of some acquaintance, and a pang of guilt would strike me. She deserved a better ending, as did those children. But Edgar's choice to spin two families out of thin air made it impossible. They'd grow up with a father branded a liar, a man who vanished from their daily lives. Maybe he'd try to re-enter their world one day, but I suspected the bitterness would run too deep. On my darkest nights, I wondered if the price of their heartbreak was worth my personal vindication. Yet each time, I recalled how he'd taken my trust, my love, and turned it into a sham. He hadn't just made a mistake. He'd methodically deceived two women over the course of years, forging false identities. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a sustained betrayal. I moved forward, step by step, building a new sense of self. I began volunteering at a local women's center, writing articles that highlighted the stories of those who faced deceit and abuse. It felt like a small way to transform my pain into something constructive, to remind others they could reclaim power. My own story was a cautionary tale I carried within me, a quiet testament that illusions, though tempting, can crumble in an instant. Over time, I found that channeling my anger into empathetic activism granted me a sense of purpose I'd lost after Edgar's betrayal. Years slipped by. I sometimes ran into mutual acquaintances who mentioned Edgar in passing. He'd left the state, they said, drifting from one temporary gig to another. No one was sure where exactly he lived or how he survived. Rumor had it he tried to reconcile with Amber, but she refused him. I felt a complicated swirl of relief and sadness. I wouldn't wish total ruination on many people, but Edgar had all but invited it upon himself. My revenge had succeeded in that regard, but it brought no tidy resolution, just a scattering of damaged lives. The cost was enormous, the wreckage too wide to fully comprehend. One day, I received a letter in the mail, no return address. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but inside was a short message, scribbled on a scrap of paper. It read, "I'm sorry. E." My heart kicked in my chest as I stared at those words. It had to be from Edgar. But why now, after so many years? I felt a surge of anger, followed by a wave of unexpected pity. He was probably trying to ease his conscience, to find a shred of redemption in an apology scrawled on a slip of paper. I tore it up, my hands shaking, refusing to let his fleeting remorse anchor itself in my life. Then I tossed the pieces in the trash, determined to keep moving forward. But the note lingered in my thoughts, an echo of old wounds. Though I never responded, it forced me to wrestle with my lingering resentment. I had spent so much time consumed by vengeance, living in the shadow of that betrayal, that I'd never truly allowed myself to mourn. The tears that came then were different from before. They were tears of final release, acknowledging both the love I once felt and the destruction I'd unleashed in response. We'd both become villains in each other's stories, in our own ways. Maybe this apology was his attempt at closure. It didn't change the past, but it nudged me toward a deeper acceptance. Ultimately, healing required me to make a choice, to remain defined by Edgar's deceit and my subsequent revenge, or to redefine my life on my own terms. I chose the latter. I found a city across the country, got a fresh start, found an apartment with a small balcony where I tended potted plants. My freelance writing thrived, and I discovered a circle of supportive friends who knew nothing of my past unless I chose to tell them. It was liberating to be in a place where nobody looked at me with pity or whispered about the scandal of the bigamist husband. I had the chance to sculpt a new identity, shaped only by who I was now and who I aspired to be. Some nights, though, I'd dream about Edgar, about the life we almost had. I'd wake up tangled in sheets, heart pounding, tasting the metallic tang of regret on my tongue. But those instances grew less frequent. With each passing year, the memory of that twisted chapter became more like a distant cautionary tale. I learned to see my role clearly. I was the wife who uncovered his secret and unleashed a devastation that ended two families, the one he shared with me and the one he shared with Amber. It took me a long time to accept that no one truly won in this scenario. My actions were justified, but justice doesn't always lead to a happy ending. Occasionally, I'd recall the day I confronted him and wonder if I could have sat him down privately instead, forced him to choose or to come clean without that savage spectacle. But the part of me that remembers the despair of discovering he had 2 children in a suburban house I knew nothing about still flares with righteous indignation. He didn't deserve the courtesy of a gentle resolution. Maybe that's a harsh stance, but heartbreak often breeds harshness. It's the curse of being deeply wronged. There came a point when I realized I no longer hated him, that my scorn had burned itself out. Instead, I felt a strange sorrow, as though we were 2 people who could have loved each other if only the circumstances had been different, if only he'd been honest from the start. But that honesty never existed. So I regarded my history with him as a testament to the risk of trusting blindly, and the lengths one might go to restore their sense of power when betrayed. That was the final lesson I took from the chaos, that betrayal demands a response, but revenge rarely yields a clean victory. At times I'd see couples walking in the park or families with children giggling on playgrounds, and a pang of what might have been would surge through me. Did Edgar ever feel the same pang when he saw a happy family? Possibly. But by that point, we were 2 separate orbits, no longer intersecting. Life had moved us forward in different directions, each bearing the scars of our shared catastrophe. My parents eventually stopped asking about him. My father, who once questioned Edgar's background, admitted he regretted not pushing me harder to see the truth. I told him it wouldn't have made a difference. Love makes us deaf to warning bells. My father offered a wan smile, hugging me. Maybe we both understood we had each done what we could under the illusions Edgar so cleverly forged. Time, in its relentless march, gradually softened the edges of that bitter chapter. I kept writing, eventually turning to short fiction that explored themes of trust and deceit. Perhaps it was my way of alchemizing personal trauma into creative expression. My stories found a niche audience, and I made enough money to live comfortably. Some readers asked if I based my stories on real-life experiences. I'd smile and give a cryptic answer. Perhaps I found satisfaction in weaving fictional betrayals on the page, controlling their outcomes in a way I couldn't control my own life story. Sometimes I still pictured those children, Amber's kids, wondering if they'd grown tall, if they remembered Edgar as a loving father, or if they now despised him. A pang of guilt pricked me. But then again, I told myself that none of this was my doing alone. Edgar had orchestrated the double life. I'd simply refused to let him continue. If that was a sin, it was one I'd bear, but I refused to shoulder the entire burden of blame. In moments of reflection, I hope those children found a sense of stability, that Amber found someone honest to share her life with, that her kids learned not all fathers lie. A few years passed. I fell in love again, tentatively, with a man named Jared who was patient enough to handle my trust issues. He listened to my story one evening after I'd mustered the courage to share it fully, from the first spark of doubt to the final legal charges. I expected him to recoil or judge me for the severity of my revenge. Instead, he placed a comforting hand over mine and said, "You did what you had to do." That simple validation melted a piece of my old bitterness. We didn't rush into marriage or children, but we built a solid foundation of honesty, a mutual promise that we'd never hide the truth from each other. It felt like a second chance at a genuine life. When I visited my childhood home, I found an old album with photos from my wedding to Edgar. My mother had tucked it away. She asked if I wanted her to throw it out. I hesitated, then flipped through the pages. I saw my younger self smiling, eyes brimming with hope, Edgar standing beside me with that quiet charm. It felt like gazing at two ghosts. I closed the album gently. "Keep it," I said. "It's part of my history." The photos were remnants of a love that once felt unbreakable, a testament to how fragile illusions can be. My mother nodded, tears in her eyes, and put the album back into storage. Whenever I was asked about forgiveness, I said I'd come to peace with the past. But I wasn't sure if I forgave Edgar in any conventional sense. Maybe I forgave the man he pretended to be, the one I loved so deeply. But the real Edgar, the one who lived two lives and lied without hesitation, I could never truly forgive. I accepted what happened, which might be the closest thing to forgiveness I could muster. And perhaps that was enough. My life moved forward. I built a career, nurtured healthy relationships, rediscovered my capacity for joy. Yet I knew I was forever changed by what had transpired. Any sense of naive trust was gone, replaced by a measured caution. Still, I refused to let cynicism define me. I strove to remain open to the possibility that people could be genuine. Edgar was just one person who made unspeakable choices. The world held countless others with kinder hearts. In a sense, Edgar unwittingly taught me resilience. My revenge destroyed both families, mine and the one he built with Amber, but it also freed me from his toxic deceit. In that space of destruction, I found the raw materials to rebuild a more authentic life. The process was painful, often lonely, but it forged in me a strength I didn't know I possessed. I had once feared how he might leave me, yet in the end, I was the one who left him, albeit with the force of legal documentation and exposed secrets. That act reclaimed my agency, reminding me that I wasn't just a victim, but a person capable of decisive, if ruthless, action. Even though my story might appear tragic, I learned that tragedy doesn't preclude growth. A new dawn can rise over scorched earth. The echoes of heartbreak linger, but they need not dictate every moment of the future. I discovered new forms of happiness: a quiet morning walk in a city park, the laughter shared with new friends, the exhilarating rush of writing a short story that resonated with readers. Each day, I worked to fill the hollows that Edgar's betrayal carved out. Over time, I did. At least enough that the old wounds felt less like open sores and more like scars that told a tale of survival. On quiet evenings, when the sun sets behind my window, I sometimes recall the moment I stood in Amber's living room, confronting Edgar. I remember the fear and desperation in his eyes, the tears streaming down her face, and the camera quietly recording it all. That was the point of no return, the instant where illusions were ripped away in brutal fashion. Perhaps a part of me still wonders if I could have chosen a gentler path. But even if I'd tried, I suspect Edgar's lies would have metastasized into something worse, devouring more years of my life. So maybe my revenge, harsh and explosive as it was, saved me from a deeper agony. In that sense, I can't regret it fully. As for whether I truly destroyed both families, the answer is yes. My marriage ended in tatters, and his second family dissolved under the weight of betrayal. But I also know that from destruction comes transformation. Amber and I, though never again in contact, both moved on to new chapters. The children might grow up with a murky perception of their father, but hopefully, they will also learn resilience from their mother's strength. And I made choices that, while painful, ultimately led me to a place of self-reliance and honesty. Life is messy, full of twists that rarely untangle neatly. All we can do is own our decisions and carry the consequences. In some fleeting visions, I imagine a future where Edgar truly repents, reconstructs himself as an honest man, and tries to reconnect with his children. Maybe in that distant tomorrow, he finds a way to atone for his lies. But that has no bearing on me now. I closed that chapter, and no letter or apology can undo the damage. My heart has found new paths, shaped by the lessons of betrayal and the necessity of standing up for oneself. I am not the same woman Edgar married. I've shed that skin, forging a version of myself that no longer fears hidden secrets or half-truths. If there is a final reflection to glean from this saga, it's that betrayal, once exposed, demands a reckoning that can spare no one. The illusions Edgar spun were as delicate as spider silk, easily torn by the sharp edge of truth. My revenge was swift and thorough, leaving him stripped of his false stability. I might have believed in the heat of that moment that satisfaction would come from seeing him destroyed. But in reality, destruction is never so clean. It left me with shards of regret, pity, and sorrow, even as it freed me. Life, in its relentless way, moves forward regardless, giving us small mercies and fresh hopes. So, although I can't say I emerged unscathed, I did emerge stronger, with a clearer vision of my worth and a steeled determination never to be deceived so profoundly again. That is how I came to understand the full weight of my husband's deception and the cost of my revenge. It wasn't a triumphant victory. It was a reckoning that pulled everything down, leaving 2 broken families in its wake. And in that rubble, I picked up the pieces of myself and rebuilt a life. If I had to do it over again, I'm not sure I'd change a thing. Because sometimes the only way to reclaim yourself is to tear down the very illusions that once brought comfort. And though it breaks your heart, and breaks others' hearts along with it, there's a strange, terrible beauty in the truth finally coming to light. Even if it leaves you standing amid ashes, at least you stand there knowing the reality of what was, and you can choose how to move forward. That choice, painful as it might be, is better than living a lie.